So why did I decide to write this book? There are only a handful of countries that had anything to do with nuclear weapons, and Kazakhstan is one of them. And initially, as a newly minted PhD, which I did in Britain, and which was already on nuclear issues, on issues of cooperative threat reduction, I focused on the US and Russia. So I wanted to look specifically at decision-making, why countries decide to give up nuclear weapons or why they decide to have them. And I thought I would use Kazakhstan as a case study. You know, I was very into Scott Sagan's 3 models in search of a poem, and I wanted to just check all these models and apply them to Kazakhstan's case. But gradually, as I started traveling to the region in eastern Kazakhstan, the region that was used by the Soviet military to conduct nuclear tests, as I started working in the archives and meeting survivors of nuclear tests, I recognized that I couldn't tell the political, the diplomatic story without telling the Soviet period story and just describe the legacy of the nuclear test, but also the important story of the anti-nuclear movement. And throughout it all, it took me 15 years to research and write this book because I was never obligated to write it. I'm not on tenure track. It was never part of any project or grant or anything like that. So it was more of a personal endeavor. And what sustained me, I think it's the personal conviction that it was an important story to tell and all the personal reasons that drove me. The family of my father is actually from Semipalatinsk, and my father spent his youth in the city, which is the major city closest to the testing site. And so as a child, I would travel to that city, and I have affinity for the region. And also, as Bill mentioned, that my father was an advisor to the Kazakh leadership in the early 90s, and nuclear portfolio wasn't the only subject area that he worked on, but it was an important one. And so, obviously I was small. Bill doesn't exaggerate that at the time, I was a school child, and I couldn't grasp the importance of that period. But I heard the conversations at home. And for example, my father and Minister Shkolnik, I don't know, would draw something on napkins and discuss something. And I think I just absorbed by osmosis that something important was happening. And so I felt it was my mission as a nuclear scholar, as a native of Kazakhstan, and as a daughter to pursue this research and write this book. My book consists of 2 parts. The first one is more Soviet period, the Soviet nuclear tests, and the second one is more diplomacy and the politics of giving up nuclear weapons. I just want to start with the first half of the book. And, again, I want to add a personal reflection. I've been in the field for a while now. I studied my PhD on nuclear issues in 2000. And I thought I knew and I understood the magnitude of what nuclear tests can do to people. I thought I understood the implications of choices made on nuclear policy issues. And, it was a while ago that I started traveling to Semipalatinsk, to conferences in the capital, meeting survivors of nuclear tests. But I think up until I actually found myself on a helicopter above the nuclear test that I could understand the magnitude. And that happened, I think it was around 2014 or 15. And we were a group of Kazakhs, Russians, and Americans who traveled there for an oral history project. And so we were on a helicopter above the testing site, and just the size, I knew it was the size of a medium-sized country, but it's really different when you see it from above. And also when it's your own land and you see the difference between the untouched land and the former testing site, which is, bears obvious signs of military activity. That's the cover, and that's the photo I took in the Kazakhstan.
Who's your publisher?
Stanford University Press. So Kazakhstan's nuclear story started in the 40s, and the Soviet government, through all its might, they were rushing to equalize with Americans, and they had a few sites that they considered for a future testing site, and they chose Kazakhstan, Eastern Kazakhstan. And when I read Soviet-era documents, and when I read them as a Kazakh, it was really painful because the discussion was very technocratic. It was about, geography, geology. They would discuss access to sand and water as construction material. They would call it uninhabited, which was completely untrue because right on the site, on what would become the site of the test, there were many rural settlements. Many people would have livestock and in huge quantities. And so people really depended on that land for their well-being. But also the closest major city, which was around 75 miles away from the future site, it had special value for Kazakhs. And I should preface by saying that Kazakhs in general, they have special affinity for the land, ancestral land, and which I find very similar to the Marshallese. It's an interesting parallel, I think. And so that city, it had special place in the Kazakh consciousness because for some reason, I don't know why, but most of our most famous educators, poets, writers are coming from that exact region, including Abai, who is considered to be the father of Kazakh literature. Here you see the photo of his burial place, which is just 30 miles away from the polygon. And then something that is less known, during the period when Russia already controlled Central Asia, it wasn't the Soviet period yet, but before that, for a short period of time, Kazakhs in Semipalatinsk were able to establish an autonomous state called Alashavda, and the whole point of that autonomous state was to have more control over the fate of ethnic Kazakhs who lived there. But then also for reasons of, people being sent to exile, there was this special atmosphere of Russian intellectuals and Kazakh intellectuals talking to each other, collaborating, and all living together in Semipalatinsk. So it's a very special place. But if you read the Soviet documents, you would think it's a barren land, nothing of value there, nothing is happening there. And so the test continued for 40 years, and sometimes within Kazakhstan, I think there is this maybe sentiment or emotion that the Soviets chose Kazakhstan to make experiments on Kazakhs so that it was part of genocide. And I would, as a scholar, I would warn against going to that extreme because it was more that the priority was military. There were military tasks that were prioritized. It's just that they didn't care at all about the local people. And this lack of care, but it wasn't that, on purpose they wanted to conduct experiments. But I want to give just one example that shows the lack of care. And that example comes from 1953 when Soviet scientists created the first thermonuclear device. And they were already just about to test it. And thermonuclear device is much more powerful than a regular nuclear device. And it's at the last minute that somebody, mid-level employee of the ministry in charge of the nuclear complex, he questioned it and he said, this is going to be a completely different magnitude. Did we think about the fallout? And Sakharov writes in his memoirs, he admits, he says, we were rushing so much, we actually didn't think about it. So they started making some last-minute calculations, and they understood that they had two options. either to delay a test and prepare to do it in a different way, not drop the device from a tower, but rather from a plane, or they could evacuate people in a rush. They decided they didn't want to delay the test. They started evacuating people, and I just want you to empathize with people who lived there at the time. So you just live your normal life in a rural settlement, and suddenly military appears from nowhere, and they tell you, pack up everything, including your livestock, and we are going to evacuate you. We are not going to tell you where you're going. We're not going to tell you why, when you will come back, or if you'll come back. And so one of the soldiers who was helping with the evacuation, he describes the scene of confusion in the steppe. Where neither the soldiers nor the shocked locals knew. Panic reigned in the steppe. Bewildered people waited for something terrible to happen. And actually, it remains a question whether it even helped that they evacuated them, because they brought them back in a couple of weeks. When they came back, the pets, half of them were dead, half had their fur burned, and their water wells were damaged, and obviously, the land was contaminated. And that's just one of many examples of how, it worked at the time. And of course, there was immediate effect when most of the people spent their time outside with livestock or doing things outside, and nobody was ever warned about nuclear tests and atmospheric tests. You know how harmful they can be. But also this long-term exposure, because grass got contaminated, and then animals ate that contaminated grass, and people ate meat from these animals, and they drank milk. And so it's in a few years that the health impact became visible. People started dying from cancer, from blood diseases, and you would think that somebody would care enough to do comprehensive studies, but no, there were no comprehensive studies. There were smaller scale studies, but they were used for military purposes. So whatever data was collected, it was guarded. It was classified. It was not shared with local healthcare authorities. And I just want you to read just one of hundreds of testimonies available from that region. And I want to bring your attention to the fact that she mentions her son dying by suicide. And suicide was such an unusual phenomenon for Kazakhs, they didn't even have a word for it in the Kazakh language. And when I interviewed elders, the few remaining elders from the region, they would say that initially, because it's against Islamic tradition, to commit suicide, that they buried people who died from suicide separately. But then there were too many of them, and he said, we decided we should bury them at regular cemeteries, and we started calling it polygon disease. Polygon is a Russian word for the nuclear testing site. And if you read the documents from the Soviet period, there is definitely this partly racial undertone, but also just in general the inferior, the attitude that somehow people who lived in Kazakhstan were inferior. And for example, the Soviet military would claim that Kazakhs were getting sick and dying there near the testing site because their diet was poor, they were not getting enough vitamins, and that their hygiene was poor. And it's true that the living conditions were very poor in the region, but still, they were poor in other places, and it's there that the people were dealing with so many health issues. And so for a long time, it seemed as though there was no recourse, because everything was fully controlled. Local doctors were not allowed to even give an honest diagnosis. If somebody died from stomach cancer, it would be recorded as stomach disease. Nobody was allowed to talk about it. And so that continued for 40 years. There were some attempts in the 50s and early 60s by some prominent people to bring attention to the plight of the region, but they were suppressed. And then, you know how it happens in history, sometimes just something shifts on macro level, on micro level, and then there is just one event that might appear minor but can really overhaul the entire system. And so what was happening at the macro level, at the Soviet level, Gorbachev came to power, and he was a different kind of leader. He allowed some political freedoms. Most importantly, the monopoly of the Communist Party was eliminated. So now other public movements were allowed, including the environmental ones. Perestroika, glasnost, people could talk more, they could criticize the government a little bit more. But also in Kazakhstan. So, you know, for those of you who are not familiar with the Soviet Union and how it used to be, basically the republics were always suppressed in terms of their own national identity. I'm coming from a big city in Kazakhstan, and it's only now that I'm learning my own native language, because I lived in a big city. There were only 2 schools that taught Kazakh. Culturally as well, there was suppression of anything that was too traditional, including pieces of literature, theater. But in the 80s, you can feel this resurrection of national identity. And so, you know, there is this internal push that, you know, people wanted more autonomy. They didn't want Moscow to decide for them. And against this macro situation, it's this one event that is the last drop. And that happens on February 12th of 1989. That was the date of just a regular underground nuclear test. And in about 1/3 of the cases with underground nuclear tests, some venting of radioactive gases occurred. It was considered to be normal, and usually, you know, these gases, they evaporate pretty quickly. But on that occasion, the contamination was severe, and so what happened is that the radiation detectors in a nearby other military town, not the one affiliated with the polygon, but the base of Soviet heavy bombers, a place called Togzhan, their devices picked up that the radiation was pretty high, and so the military commander ordered his people not to go to the canteen. Kids were asked to stay at home, not to go to the kindergarten. And what's important, and I think it's because of perestroika, this military commander decided not to hide this fact. So when he got an inquiry from the local regional governor of Semipalatinsk, he confronted him. He said, yes, our devices are registering high levels. The same information is transferred to another key person, and that person was and is, he's still alive, a famous Kazakh writer, Olzha Suleimanov. But in addition to being a writer, back at the time, he was a member of the Soviet parliament. And so as a member of the Soviet parliament, he was running for re-election, and he had a spot on Kazakh national TV. So he uses that scheduled spot and basically tells the people who are listening to him that, you know, they lied to us. They said that underground nuclear tests caused no contamination, but that was a lie, and we have information that actually contamination occurs. We've had enough. Those who are against nuclear tests come to the house of writers in Almaty in a few days. What he didn't, I think, know is the kind of response he will receive. Thousands of people showed up. Here you see a still from inside of the House of Writers, which could fit 400 people. Others waited outside. And it was February in Kazakhstan. And when I interviewed the participants of that first rally, they all described it as raw emotions, electrifying atmosphere. And Suleimanov himself, he said that morning before the rally, he actually didn't have it as an idea that he should ask for a formal anti-nuclear movement, but he said he was so moved by the response from the people that it was more spontaneous that they decided to create something more formal. And from the rally, I just wanted again to quote just one person, and that's a female obstetrician from one of the villages in the Semipalatinsk region, and this is what she said. She was the one who was delivering babies there for 30 years, and that day she said, "In the last 6 months, out of 48 births, 12 were tragic. 6 newborns died and 6 were born without limbs." And so, you know, the movement is created, and I just want to mention a couple of important things. First, that movement was really a representation of the entire Kazakhstan, multi-ethnic, people of all professions, from creative industries, prominent writers, journalists, but also miners, and really it was representing the entire Kazakhstan. But also, I just want to remind, it was 1989, no internet, no social media. Within days, they had millions of people who signed up, who signed petitions. It's because they could rely on the regional networks of journalists to do that. And I find the story of the anti-nuclear movement to be really a good example of the people of Kazakhstan reclaiming the agency. And so for the next 2 years, they were protesting, rallying, and again, for those of you who know Kazakh politics, you probably heard more about the president this, the president that, the president signed the decree, the president closed the nuclear testing site. The role of the people and the civil grassroots effort is not as prominently featured, unfortunately. Even within Kazakhstan, not even, but within Kazakhstan, people, why we don't know as much about it, and that's for internal political reasons. But I always want to give credit to the movement. And of course, it wasn't, I should also mention that it's not that the government created the movement, but the government definitely wasn't against it, because in a way, for its political struggle with Moscow, they could use it, and for example, in communication with Moscow, especially during the initial period, they could, use it a little bit as a shield, so to speak, because they could say our people are protesting, but yeah, what I want to say here is that we should remember about just regular people who were actually on the streets. It also moves me that Kazakh people were not alone. Peace activists from the United States, physicians from Canada, Europe, activists from Russia, Hibakusha from Japan, they would come and they would rally together. And it's really nice how Kazakh activists would talk about their trips to the US, to California actually. Some of them came to California. And they would say, it's the American peace activists who taught us how to do civil disobedience activities. They would share literature with us. And then the American participants would reflect. They would say, we felt even kind of embarrassed when we went to Kazakhstan. It was still the Soviet Union, a Soviet Republic, and we looked at all these people, not afraid and being on the streets, and they said, we kind of felt embarrassed that they could do it on such a scale and while still being part of the Soviet system. And so I think it was really mutually inspiring. And so finally, on August 29th of 1991, the Kazakh president Nazarbayev signed the decree, shut down the testing site, and as I said, propped by the people. Again, for those of you who study politics, it's important to remind that it was August of 1991. Can anybody remember what's so special about August 91?
Putsch, I don't know what's it, coup d'etat or something. It wasn't coup d'etat, but the Soviet government was kind of locked into this building of the parliament in Moscow, and basically the collapse of Soviet Union started. as far as I understand.
So correct, it was an attempted coup d'etat, so it was a sign that the Soviet system was on its last legs, and so that also helped, to use this moment and to push for the closure of the site. Still, formally, Kazakhstan was still part of the Soviet Union, and so I think it's important that the decree was signed while Kazakhstan was still part of the Soviet Union. What's the situation now? I can give you a couple of data points from the Kazakhstan Institute for Radiation Medicine and Ecology. They can confirm that there are higher mortality and cancer rates among those who were exposed to long-term radiation. They also did studies on the second and third generation of people, also health impact. And I just want to add my own personal observations. A few years ago, I started visiting the villages regularly, and there are two things that I've noticed. Number one, it's very hard to find anybody past the retirement age. People are just not living long enough. And number two, there are too many children who have visible health issues. And so, those who are children now, that means they're the fourth generation. I just want to give you one example. It's a family with who I am now friends in the village of Karaul. And if this family originally had 6 daughters. One died at the age of 6. On the photo, you can see 2 youngest daughters, and the older one had facial bone cancer at the age of, I think, 6. And for 2 years, she had to go through chemo. Thanks God, she got cured from cancer, but she has other serious health issues. And if you look at the younger girl, you'll notice that on the left hand, she's actually missing 4 fingers. And we went to see this family straight after visiting another family where a little boy of 6 months had 6 fingers. And it's very traumatic, to see it with your own eyes. And especially, it's really hard for me now to reconcile all the policy discussions that I'm observing, whether, in New York or Vienna, in DC, with what I actually see on the ground. And for me, that's the main lesson from all of this, is that nuclear policy decisions are not abstract. We're not talking about abstract issues, and we really should be more mindful about the people who are continuing to pay the price for the nuclear weapons programs. And I just now want very briefly to talk about what happened after the collapse. And Kazakhstan inherited, in terms of numbers, the 4th largest nuclear arsenal in the world. The important distinction is that Kazakhstan did not have access to command and control of weapons, but still it was an independent state, and the weapons were on its territory, and their fate could not be decided without Kazakhstan. But it also had tons of nuclear material and nuclear facilities. And here the important distinction is that Kazakhstan was in full control of those facilities and material. So when we discuss giving up the arsenal, for me it's almost more important what it decided on the material and the facilities, because it fully controlled them. And for those of you who are studying non-proliferation, you know how important nuclear material is in the nuclear program. The status of nuclear weapons was not decided until March of 1994. So any discussion that somehow by default they were supposed to, that they belong to Russia, that's incorrect. The formal legal status was only decided in March of 1994, but before that it was unclear. So why did Kazakhstan decide to, give up not only the weapons, which I said had some limitations, but also material and facilities? And, that decision wasn't instantaneous, but, it came pretty early on, and that was taken with full consideration of Kazakhstan's security needs, political situation, diplomatic priorities. And I think fundamentally what Kazakhstan's leadership realized was that in order to save its sovereignty, to build itself as a state, trying to get into a nuclear club would be detrimental and would be an obstacle to what it wanted and what it needed. And so let's look at some of the factors. Number one concern for Kazakhstan was security. And it's really interesting to see the difference between the interviews I've done with American policymakers and Kazakh policymakers. So if you interview Kazakh policymakers from that time, they talk so much about security guarantees, security. In Russian, there is one word, guarantee. There is no difference between guarantees and assurances. But just in general, I think what Kazakhstan needed and what they really paid attention to was security. While for American policymakers, they mention it in passing. I think they don't fully recognize how important that was for Kazakhstan because the geopolitics. Kazakhstan bordering Russia and China, two nuclear powers. Already back at the time, Russian nationalists would constantly talk about the fact that the northern part of Kazakhstan, home to many ethnic Russians, should go to Russia. And so there was a lot of uneasiness. China, Kazakhstan inherited border disputes from the Soviet period between the Soviet Union and China. And it's only later on that independent Kazakhstan demarcated the borders and everything is fine now, but early 90s, that's the situation. And so it was this search for some security guarantees, assurances that was at the heart of all negotiations, which the international community and primarily the United States was able to offer. And for Kazakhstan, it was important to become the part of the Tashkent Collective Security Treaty because it meant that, if you're in a collective defense mechanism with Russia, you can worry a little bit less about Russia. So that was important. It was important that Kazakhstan and the US negotiated and agreed on language on security assurances that would be included into the US-Kazakhstan Charter on Democratic Partnership. So that agreement was reached in November of 93, and that's why in December of 93, Kazakhstan joined the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state, and then later on, of course, the Budapest Memorandum. Yesterday, when I was presenting at Stanford, somebody asked a good question, how seriously Kazakhs viewed the Budapest Memorandum, whether they understood its limitations or whether they thought it was a guarantee. And I want to say from what I've read and from the interviews I did, they definitely treated it as a serious commitment, as a serious document. Of course, they understood that it wasn't the equivalent of guarantees or anything close to Article 5 of NATO commitment, but they treated it as a serious commitment at the highest political level. And so I think it's very unfortunate that after 2014 and Russia's annexation of Crimea, the value of the document was just, the norm was shattered, I think, at the time, and now even more so. But I just want to point here that security was important and that for Kazakhstan it was very important to get those assurances. But on a more practical level, I was small or young, and so even I don't look at that period as something horrible, but when I think about it now, 91, there was nothing in the stores. Like literally, there was no food, right? Many factories just stopped working. Full crisis, and Bill traveled to the region at the time. He knows, like, no electricity in some places and no salaries for months. But at the same time, Kazakhstan had so many riches in its land, oil and other mineral resources, but in order to start getting any money for that, they needed access to foreign direct investment, technology, and they understood that if somehow they would start saying, oh, maybe we should become a nuclear power and go against all the norms, that that would preclude them from getting all of this, from getting access to all of that, plus the markets. And again, on a practical level, they understood that both to keep anything, but also to give up everything, they needed some help from the outside. And you know, the trauma of the Soviet nuclear test meant that they were really worried about nuclear safety. And again, it was very important that the international community was there to help. Under the non-Luga Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, for example, the United States could offer help with denuclearization. Domestically conducive situation because no political opposition, centralized decision-making, unlike in Ukraine, though it's Nazarbayev and a few people around him who could make all decisions. There were some nationalist voices in support of a nuclear choice, but they didn't have political power. But what I think I find most important for me, especially as I work in this field now, is when I read the documents and policy memos from the early 90s, I just feel so proud that despite the fact that Kazakh policy advisors viewed the NPT as unfair and as having issues, and that's 91, 92, so it's even before NPT was renewed. They didn't even know if it would continue to exist. And also up until, you know, a little bit into 92, China and France were not even part. And so they understood all the problems with the NPT, but they still considered it to be an important norm. And so there was a lot of discussion that we do not want to undermine the norm. We do not want to become a pariah state. It's important for us to be as a responsible member of the international community. And so, you know, by 95, all missiles and nuclear warheads had been removed. And I just want to show you the last few slides because I really want to hear your questions, but just so that you know and can ask me questions if you want, how the actual denuclearization was proceeding. So with the destruction of missile silos, the first stage, it was Russian military only that was present, and they were blowing up silos, but just to meet START criteria that, you know, it should be 1.5 meter crater and so on. But it was still, you know, you would have those silo doors just lying there, half destroyed, and it was Kazakhs and Americans then completed the second stage to fully eliminate the infrastructure. There were very Hollywood-like projects to remove nuclear material, in this case highly enriched uranium, from Kazakhstan to Oak Ridge. There were projects on removing spent fuel from the fast breeder reactor. A lot of work that, you know, for more than a decade they were working at the former testing site, securing tunnels and boreholes and securing material. And this is the final slide, and I like to end on this hopeful note because Kazakhstan cannot rewrite its history, and it was a fateful decision that the Soviet Union decided to build its nuclear weapons site on Kazakhstan's territory. But I think I can understand the pride of scientists and people who are involved in the program, because it's also you know, it's a scientific achievement and, you know, engineering marvel, and I like the idea that it's now used for something that contributes to international security, and it's this turnaround that I find helpful in order to kind of move away from the tragedy of it all and look into the future. And as one example, there is no better place or infrastructure to conduct, for example, field exercises in support of the comprehensive test ban treaty verification system. And here you just see one example that they did a field exercise, and so I just want to end on this that I think it's also important to kind of to move forward in a way in a manner that is constructive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A few comments, and then we'll open it up. as Togzhan knows, I've also been very focused on many of the topics that you raised, including one that you didn't mention, which was the Central Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone. But that's for a later discussion. The two things that I just wanted to flag, one, I think a number of you, if you haven't seen the film, would find it very powerful, related to the first part of your presentation. We actually had former foreign minister and at the time Ambassador Idrisov here at the time that Kazakhstan had a film that was entered in a film competition, I think in Los Angeles. I think it was called Kazakhstan. And I don't know if anybody here, Margarita probably, we showed it over here. It really depicts much of what you were talking about in the Semipalatinsk region. And so I highly recommend, it's just extraordinarily, it's almost excruciatingly painful to observe, but I suspect you could still find that online, and actually, Margarita, maybe we should show it at some point here. I think it would be worthwhile to observe. The second thing, I wish I had given more thought to this before we convened the meeting. A number of my staff know that I have a flower, which used to be a blue flower, that I plucked from the epicenter of the first test in Semipalatinsk, which I picked up right before the first conference on the Central Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, which I traveled to from Kazakhstan in Uzbekistan. And what's interesting, among other things, when I brought the flower back to the office here, and we were in another building at the time in our seminar room, and I thought, let's put it up in the seminar room, and everybody got very, very nervous because they were so concerned about the radioactivity that might exist. And so I remember John Leppingwell was with us, and we actually got a dosimeter, and we measured the level of radioactivity, and it was safe. The flower was blue. And I plucked it because when I went to the conference on the Central Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, I held it up as a hopeful sign that perhaps even at this, the center of the nuclear testing program, maybe there was a potential for recovery. My flower has now faded, perhaps as has hope regarding the elimination of nuclear weapons testing, but nonetheless, it was an interesting kind of connection that if anybody's interested, I can show you the now faded flower, which I still have displayed up in my office. Jean, I know you were anxious to...
Yes, thank you.
Do you want to identify... I think
of course, I'm Jean Dupre. I'm here at CNS, and I'm formerly involved with the CCBTO. Togzhan, thank you so much. Fascinating presentation. In fact, your last slide actually segues into also what Bill just mentioned. So a comment and a question. So I was privileged to visit Kazakhstan with the Executive Secretary of the CCBTO, Timur Taft at the time, and Yukiya Imanov, who was a diplomat in residence here, in 2011, if I remember correctly. And I was struck by two things. One, we went to Semai City for a wreath-laying ceremony at that beautiful monument, and that there were roughly about 15,000 people lining the street to witness this event. And two, that we went to the polygon, the closest that we could get to that was considered safe from the test site. And I still consider this this day as the most evil place that I've been to in my life. Just the thought of what happened. And so, what you mentioned, in the policy discourse, we often forget about the plight of people. Right? So, we talk about the CTBT and we talk about the lack of entry force and so on, but you actually forget that it's about nuclear testing, right? It's about preventing nuclear testing, but the CTBT has no reparations for past testing. But the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, to some extent, has that article about environmental reparations. And so, obviously, non-Lugar, CTR, I'm not sure that enough has been done in Kazakhstan. to do that. I'd like your views on that. That was about removing the material, removing the weapons, but the environmental and the humanitarian impact remained. I was struck, and we were talking with the fellows last week about the CTBT and about what Marshall Islands did. The Marshall Islands took the issue to the Human Rights Council. And on Friday last week, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution without a vote in support of the Marshallese plight, where they maintain that nuclear testing is a human rights violation. There was an attempt by the US, the UK, India, Pakistan, and perhaps other nuclear weapon states to block it. So this is, I think, a major step. So I'd like a comment from your feedback. How do you think, because the reason why these states try to block it is because they say this is going to lead to Kazakhstan and others, and Masako was just at the Navajo Nation, potentially coming to the Human Rights Council and doing the same thing. So do you think there's a potential rise of this awareness in countries, and hopefully Bill's flower will turn blue again?
John, thank you so much. I've noticed the kind of despicable language some of the nuclear powers used when they were commenting on the proposed resolution, which I think is really quite shameful. So speaking specifically about Kazakhstan, obviously it's the Soviet program that did it, and Russia, and in a way, Soviet Union doesn't exist, so who do you ask, for example, for reparations? The logical continuation is that Russia inherited the nuclear weapons, so it should also have inherited the responsibility for the program. Kazakhstan formally will never be able to put such a demand for reasons of geopolitics. If you look at where we are and the border that we share and the close political, economic, and social relations, it's not where I think Kazakhstan formally would ever go. But the discourse within Kazakhstan, I've just came back 2 days ago from Kazakhstan, especially from the youth. They're the ones, who are not. I describe them as though their minds are completely decolonized. They have no fear. They do not understand why there is no justice. They do not understand why we cannot demand it. And so I'm actually, while I'm not hopeful, and I maybe even think I wouldn't expect and I wouldn't demand the Kazakh government to pressure Russia, as for reasons of geopolitics, but I'm not as hopeless in terms of seeking justice, and I'll explain why. I think what we're observing with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the fact that it has articles that deal specifically with victims of nuclear use, test, and use, and land rehabilitation. Kazakhstan is working a lot with Kiribati on that. Actually today, there is an event going on positive assurances of, all on victims' assistance and so on. So I think the conversation, starting with the conferences on humanitarian impact with TPNW and just the rise of voices and reclaiming of agency of all those non-nuclear weapon states who previously somehow were relegated, right? This attitude from nuclear powers that who are you to even say anything on nuclear issues? I think it's really changing, and I think we'll be seeing more and more of this push. And I do think nuclear powers are kind of uncomfortable and nervous about many things, including reparations. Yesterday I had a good question in terms of how, whether I felt any remorse from Russian military or scientists, and when I interviewed them, and I said nobody admitted it to me directly, but I know from others, I know from my American interviewees how Russian military and scientists felt, and obviously those who have any ethics would recognize that there was a huge price that was paid by local people. So yeah, I don't think this is the question that can be shoved under the carpet, and I'm really glad to observe what's happening in the global nuclear discourse. And coming back to the beginning of your question about the CTBT ratification, actually what was one of my last sentences in a piece I did for the bulletin when Biden just came to power, and I was asked, what one advice would you give? And I was pushing for CTBT ratification, knowing full well, you know, I'm not going to say it, but I do think that CTBT ratification is one way to show respect to, you know, it might not help them, but it's just, it's one thing to acknowledge that there should not be any future nuclear tests.
John, if I can just add 2 points here. One, something that Togzhan knows very well, because we've kind of worked on this issue a long time ago when she was actually at the center. The main impetus, the principal impetus, and the only thing that made it possible for the 5 Central Asian states and their presidents to initiate a Central Asian nuclear weapons-free zone was the shared commitment about the need to remediate the damage caused not only by nuclear testing, but also by uranium mining and milling and the tailings that were contaminating, you know, the region. So the Central Asian nuclear weapons-free zone was first and foremost a zone which was driven by a desire to get international support for remediating the environmental situation in the region. It wasn't driven by concerns about nuclear security, nuclear weapons, Article 6, or whatever. And I think to some extent that's been lost sight of. And I think it would be useful in the various meetings that states parties hold with respect to nuclear weapons-free zones to reiterate, you know, the commitment to the environmental dimension. Because it's not, in some ways, people tend to get caught up in what is more a myth than a reality in terms of the Article 6 dimension here, rather than the environmental dimension. But the only point at which I think is worth noting, and I'm not endearing myself to my Kazakh friends when I mention this, but having been, you know, intimately involved in the negotiation of the Central Asian nuclear weapons-free zone, one of the shortcomings of that treaty is the paragraph 12, which has contradictory statements, one of which was inserted with Kazakh support based upon pressure from Russia to basically allow an interpretation which would, according to the Tashkent Treaty of Collective Security, under certain circumstances allow Russia to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of the states in Central Asia. It was most unfortunate. And so I think one at least has to be aware of that history as well. I think I don't disagree with anything that you know, Togzhan has mentioned in her presentation, but there were also times when, because of the geopolitics involved, that Russia was able to exert pressure on Kazakhstan, and in this instance, I think it weakened the, you know, the treaty. So I just, as a historical, at least footnote, I want to make reference to that one issue.
And as a Kazakh, I would disagree with Bill, and Bill knows we disagree on this because it's really, I think Bill is a purist, and as a non-proliferation person, I agree with him, but as somebody who's coming from Kazakhstan and who is deeply aware of our geopolitics, I think Article 12, and I think for students, you should read it for yourselves. I think it's the best they could do. They basically, the article has 2 provisions that says previous agreements shouldn't be undermined, but we are also not going to do anything that goes against the fundamental principle of this current treaty. So please don't worry, Russian nuclear weapons will not be entering Central Asia. And yes, so on this we respectfully disagree with Bill because geopolitics does matter, and you can want to have an idealistic policy, and that's something that, for example, Kazakh youth demands from the government. But if you're a state person, you have to think about the constraining factors.
Anna, please.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and it's.
You want to just introduce yourself, Anna?
I'm Atomic Steppe. I'm a professor at the NPTS program. It's a very interesting story, and I'm intrigued actually to get your book. Your book came out almost at the same time that Mariana book came about Ukraine, and in this context, I wanted to ask you. First, the document is directly document between Kazakhstan and the rest of the community, but the rest of the countries that give, that is to say, Russia, China, and the United States, right? Or not? And it's done separately from the negotiation and the Budapest Agreement. And in that context, was there any coordination between the way that Ukraine took its own path and the way that Kazakh took their own pace? And if you can summarize the differences and the similarities between the two deals, both of them were 94, right? I mean, the Budapest Agreement is 94 too, right? Yeah. So if you can elaborate on this.
So for the Russia component, I would say that the priority for Kazakhstan and the most important achievement of what made them feel better was the 1992 Collective Security Treaty. With the US, it was a bilateral document called US-Kazakhstan Charter on Democratic Partnership that was the most important. Then the Budapest Memorandum was with 3 nuclear powers, but then the other 2 also, in some ways kind of said the same. The negotiations were taking place separately between the US, Kazakhstan, US, Ukraine, but Kazakhstan was observing very closely what Ukraine was doing, because concern in Kazakhstan was that, we shouldn't get anything less what Ukraine gets. And so I think there was definitely this watching what Kiev is doing, and Kiev had a very firm position. And so there was not, some behind the scenes, very close coordination, but Kazakhs were definitely watching Ukrainians. There were also more, a little bit of coordination, or at least the joint understanding on the CTR side of things, because Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, they agreed among themselves that we wouldn't want to have this proposal of assistance to be a matter of fight between us or bargain, which, we are all in this together. But on the security guarantees, assurances, the formal negotiations were separate with each republic. And Kazakhstan was watching what Ukraine was doing or what it was getting.
And ultimately, it was very similar language in terms
exactly.
of assurances.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Margarita, please.
I'm not taking the floor from the students, but I'm Margarita, living in Nepal. I work with CNS. So, Togzhan, I heard your presentation on many occasions, and your groupie. I've been following you from Vienna to Monterey. A significant portion of the book, the part which I read, is devoted to Nevada Semipalatinsk movement, and it is such a powerful movement. Living in my native Kyrgyzstan, I actually watched on TV that march which you mentioned, and thousands of people showed up, and it was 1 million people marching. So, and I had a privilege of meeting with some of the members in '99, where I remember what was the occasion. It was the 10th anniversary of the last test conducted. So the last test was conducted in '99, so that was the 10th anniversary. And they were really amazing people, but where are they now? I mean, I know some of them are old, some of them are not active, but is there still the remnants of this movement which are active now, and what is on the agenda? When did you look at that?
So many people have passed away. The leader is still, alive, and vice president, and some members. It formally exists, and sometimes they have more commemorative events, but I wouldn't say the movement exists as a movement. I think, you know, it's almost as though I wish I think they've achieved their goal and they should have left on a high. And I think this is how it happened, because soon after they achieved it, the Olzha Suleimanov was kind of sent into political exile because he was seen as a potential candidate for presidency, and but I just feel that they've achieved their big goal, and they had some other ambitions, because they always said it's not only about the Soviet test, it's about, you know, all other polygons and testing sites. But yeah, I would say that they exist formally, and they do some sort of commemorative events, and but they're not active. I'm looking at, you know, new generation now, and we still have, I think, in Kazakhstan a lot of work to do in terms of education and awareness, and yeah, I just hope that more young people would get interested in the issues and so on. But yeah, I wouldn't say that they're doing much at the moment.
Thank you, Margarita. We have some other, please, Masako.
Thank you so much, Togzhan. I'm just so moved by everything that you said, and I also couldn't contain my excitement when you talked about the Kazakhstan's role for the TTNW, especially for the victim assistance. And as you know, the Kazakhstan is going to be the president of the third TTNW conference, and also this momentum for the victim assistance. Do you think Kazakhstan? I would like to know your perspective on how Kazakhstan could have a more influential to other so-called non-decided countries in terms of the TTNW. And I have a very specific country whom I have a very concern, which is Japan, because given the Hiroshima semi-parties project, all those kind of the local government. But I'm wondering if Kazakhstan could have any impact to convince Japanese, even as an observer, to come to the next conference. Yeah.
Thank you, Masaka. I'm not sure whether, I think Kazakhstan is always trying, and it has, you know, it really prides itself on being this convener or being friends with everybody, and, you know, doing its diplomatic work behind the scenes and in the open as well. I just don't know how much Japanese government will listen to Kazakhstan. Maybe Kazakhstan can be one of many drops. What I think the Japanese government, who it should listen to, its own people. I really feel this tension between the society that suffered from nuclear use and the government that doesn't even, you know, respect enough its own people to come and at least be an observer, right? So I think if, you know, the biggest hope lies with the Japanese civil society, that they will put enough pressure. But again, geopolitics and politics, right, of what Japanese government is prepared to do. Where I think Kazakhstan can have a role, and it's really pushing, is influencing other Central Asian neighbors. So that's, I think, more realistic and what is really a priority for the foreign policy of Kazakhstan.
What's interesting also, you know, Masako, it used to be the case when Nazarbayev was president that everybody had explained away Kazakh positions with respect to nuclear disarmament, because there was this view that he was really lobbying for the one thing that he hadn't received, which was the Nobel Peace Prize. So to me, it's quite interesting that today, I think Kazakhstan, even more so than in the past, has aligned itself with disarmament proponents. You saw very active Kazakh engagement at the NPT Review Conference, and almost every time that Kazakhstan spoke, it associated itself with the remarks and the positions outlined by Kiribati and vice versa. And it was also, I participated in the side event that the mission hosted, you know, with the president of the conference, and again, Kiribati was front and center in that. So it's an interesting dynamic, particularly at a moment when countries which in the past were, you know, gung-ho proponents of every variety of disarmament who are now pausing because of the war in Ukraine and the changed international security environment, that Kazakhstan has continued to take a position which is not probably an easy position for them to maintain because of the political, both being buffeted from China and Russia and from the U.S. on the West. So it's a really interesting dynamic. And I was actually going to ask you, do you have any insight in terms of the government's thinking now with Mr. Tokayev as the president? Is there anything any kind of shift that you have seen in?
I feel I completely agree with your assessment that it goes beyond Nazarbayev. I think there was partly hope for Nobel Prize, but it wasn't because of the Nobel Prize. I think it would be a nice bonus. But if you know Kazakhstan's history and national identity, it's actually quite logical that this topic was chosen as the foreign policy priority, but also as part of national identity. So I'm not surprised that Kazakhstan continues on this path because it's something that comes naturally. I don't have any insider knowledge, but from just conversations with my friends at the foreign ministry, they really feel strong, I think, on the TPNW and especially the victim assistance component and disarmament, and so I think it will only continue, and I think it does help that the current president, as the number 2 UN person and number 1 UN person in Geneva, that he's so well versed in the international diplomacy and nuances, and I think they're just trying their best to be helpful, not only in kind of more propaganda way. It's not only about big words. I really appreciate when they do working papers, when they do a practical component. There is a lot of important work that is happening on the verification of disarmament, because again, Kazakhstan has infrastructure and expertise that is quite unique. So I think we'll be seeing a consistency, and if anything changes, it will only be towards, being even more active and more helpful. It's not going to go away.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any other questions here? If not, let me first say personally how wonderful it is to have you back here, Togzhan. I hope that in the future you extend or have an extended stay with us. Better test Margarita to make that happen. Please join me in expressing our great appreciation to our speaker today.
Thank you.